So I want to welcome Dr. Mary Murphy, Dr. Adele Whelan, and thank them for their presentations and for being with us this morning. And I want to start off with, I think, a question that's put in a light-hearted way, but is a serious question at the same time. And I want to thank Declan Carey for sending it in. It's a question to Mary Murphy. And Mary, Declan says, based on the season that's in it, if Santa could leave one surprise present under the tree in terms of gender and work, what would you like to get?
I guess given the image of Santa is that he always carries a big sack, I'd like a bundle of presents. I always want more. But I mean, I think in my presentation, I outlined 4 key policy recommendations at the end. The idea of a participation income that would value care and other socially meaningful work. The idea of validating part-time work as a choice people should be able to make within the social protection system. The idea of individualising tax and social welfare, and the idea of making sure that our public employment supports and services are available to all, including those who aren't necessarily in receipt of a social welfare payment. I think that package would open up the tax, the welfare, and the employment support services to a much greater number of women. And I think it would particularly tackle those invisible women who are dependent in a family welfare system at the moment, dependent on their spouse. I think one of the problems at the moment is that a lot of what we have is actually genuinely gender neutral, but it's the culture and the implementation and the processes around the welfare and tax system that makes it a gendered experience. So I think that idea of moving to a society, and it's a bit like what Catherine Day quoted Roderick O'Gorman there, it's about shifting societal expectations and trying to find a package of policies and implementation processes that enable us to shift culture and societal expectations. And if we can push that societal expectation that both men and women share care and work in the labour market, you know, that if that can be the societal expectation, that we expect women and men to both have paid employment and to both participate in care, that package is what I'd like from Santa. Yeah.
Okay, well, I hope he's listening and that it doesn't come down the chimney, that it comes next year in the form of new policies.
You have to come on budget day. Yeah.
Mary, one question has just come in relating to stage 4 of the feminist model of care and work welfare. What would that look like in practice?
I mean, one of the problems is that, I mean, it's interesting that that video was from Denmark because it is the Nordic countries who have made most progress in trying to orientate their welfare systems and their welfare states towards a model where you do see more shared care and employment between men and women. The Nordic model, Norway, for example, has probably gone the furthest on implementing parental care models that include significant paternity leave. And I think that's what it would look like in practice, to be honest. More long part-time jobs, more 3/4 job options, things like 4-day weeks, more creative sense of how the working week can be restructured to enable parents realistically engage in managing care and paid employment across both parents. So there are some good policy examples in Nordic countries where it's going in that direction.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe we could have a question to Adele now. One, actually, I'll put 2 together that came in ahead of this morning. First question, Adele, is why do only 28% of women have a private occupational pension, and what could we do to increase this percentage? And second question, is the social welfare payment for carers allowance taken into consideration when carers come of age for pensions?
Thank you, Catherine. Now, the figure of 28% of women with private and occupational pensions, that comes from the study that presentation that I made. And we were focusing particularly on individuals who are 66 and over who were receiving pension income. So we're looking at a particular generation. And of course, when we talk about pensions, many things feed into it, but first and foremost, it's employment histories. So we found for those women in our study, 20% of them had never worked outside of the home. for unpaid employment, and 50% of them had worked between 1 and 30 years. Some of that was part-time, full-time. So the reasons why we don't see women registering with occupational and private pensions to the same degree is a mix of reasons: opportunity of access to employment, opportunity of access to pensions, education access also. Very much what Mary also said was in terms of social conditions. So caring responsibilities that females of this generation have and continue to have. It will be naturally lower for younger cohorts, the uptake of occupational and private pensions within women. Yeah, but you asked me, secondly, how do we improve this number? One thing to suggest is around auto-enrollment. There has been some suggestions around auto-enrollment into pensions being brought into play, where once individuals were earning a certain amount, they would be auto-enrolled into a pension scheme. So they would make payments for 6 months into a pension scheme and then have the option to opt out. If that was the case, that would increase all pension enrollments, but women also. And two other things to say is around information and education, so that women are more financially aware of the decisions that they make and how that impacts pension, and to give that considerable thought throughout the life course. And then flexible working arrangements and also care infrastructure, whether that be childcare, elder care, the infrastructure of affordable facilities for people that will allow a more shared approach and allow women to remain in the labour market to continue their payments and contributions towards pensions.
Thanks very much, Adele. Back to you, Mary. Could you explain a bit more the male breadwinner model as it applies to tax? And I think a wider question is, do you think that the culture and assumptions could be changed as quickly as policy?
It's an interesting question. First of all, the male breadwinner tax system, and this is hard to do in a minute, okay? But basically the tax system gives you tax credits and is organised around tax bands. And the system at the moment allows people in spousal relationships to transfer both some of the tax credits and some of the tax bands to the other spouse. That means that if the second earner has already transferred their tax credits and bands to the first earner, that if the second earner picks up a job, for example, they don't have any tax band or tax credit to use against their own earnings, and they get less take-home pay, if you like, than their first earner in that household. And that tends to culturally undervalue the potential earnings that women can make, because the family doesn't really look and say, this is the collective. The man kind of tends to say, well, this is what I earned after tax, and this is what you're earning after tax, and really what you're earning after tax maybe won't even cover the childcare costs. So the calculations that couples make based on their assessment of what can be earned is mediated through how they manage the transferability of the tax bands and credits. And when we say it's a male breadwinner system, it tends to culturally be used in such a way as the first earner tends to their earnings tend to be valued higher. The second question about the other thing just about a male breadwinner tax system is that transferability of bands and credits doesn't really reward socially valued work. It's not predicated on the second spouse having care obligations, for example, or care work in the home. It can be transferred even if there were no children or care functions in the home. So we tend to call it a reward for wifely labour rather than for care work. So one second kind of change could be to focus those credits and bands more on care in the home rather than maybe on general domesticity. The idea about the attitudes and policy, chicken and egg, if you like, does changing a policy lead to a change in culture, or do you need the change in culture to initiate the change in policy. I think what we've seen in relation to the experience of social change in Ireland in the last decade teaches us that values can change very quickly and cultural change can happen much more quickly than we might anticipate it. And that, you know, to some degree, the citizens' assemblies had a role in mediating some of the culture and value change that happened in relation to some previous issues that went to referendums. So I think you don't need policy to initiate cultural change. Sometimes the policy follows the cultural change. But I do think a lot of our, the culture of how we implement policy is deeply embedded in systems within the administration of tax and welfare. And sometimes, you know, we need to understand a little bit better how simple rule changes can lead, like, so for example, the administrative individualization of all social welfare and tax payments, or making individualization the default practice rather than something people have to opt into, might be a way of changing and leading to cultural changes as well. But I think you don't need the culture to change before the policy, or vice versa. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. We have a number of questions about costs, and one question about do people pay higher taxes in Denmark? I think the answer is yes. So, but what we will do is send information on relative tax levels and expenditure in Ireland. We'll send that out to you after we've been looking at getting sources for that, so you'll get that in the coming days. But another question, maybe to you again, Mary, how do we pay for changes to tax and welfare system that, as you propose, how much would it cost? I mean, I don't think you are being asked to give a particular number, but how would it be paid for? How could it be paid for?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the changes may even participate extra income. If, for example, we were more flexible about how we enabled women to access activation supports and enable them to work part-time, you may even see an increase in economic participation of particular groups like qualified adults or lone parents, and that may actually generate income rather than be a cost. So I think we need to look over a medium term at issues like this. Sometimes the changes might look costly if you introduce them in year one, but if you let them run through for a couple of years and you see the changes in economic participation that they will generate, then that brings in revenue into the system and it saves social welfare payments. And you may end up that those policy changes actually not only don't cost, but actually generate income for the state. So I think it's a very hard question to answer, because the static cost of introducing it first is very different to the dynamic cost of the outcomes it might generate even within 2 or 3 years. So it's genuinely difficult to answer that question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mary.
Catherine,
I want to bring
Adele,
I want to bring you in, but
sure.
When you have the floor, could you also deal with the question of, is women's contribution in the home now not fully recognised for pension and welfare purposes? Is this not already the case? I think that's maybe a reference to the reforms that came in 2018, but perhaps you could tackle that question as well, please.
Sure, yeah. Just first of all, to say in terms of demographic change and the funding of it, that currently there are 5 workers for every pensioner within the economy, but by 2050 there will actually only be 2 people employed for every 1 person who's a pensioner due to demographic change. So this is an important thing to keep in mind when we think about sustainability of pensions. There is going to be a change there. In terms of home care, there was a change made in 2012. So that was a specific benefit for those who are home caring. And so 2 types of pensions. We've contributory pensions and non-contributory. So for contributory pensions, up to 20 years of caring can be allowed for within the contributions. So it's up to 20 years can be considered for caring responsibilities.
Okay, thanks very much. Now, as always, the clock is our enemy, but I can see that the discussion has started and you'll be able to continue it in your breakout groups. Mary Murphy, can I just ask you one last question? Because I think you generated a lot of interest with your phrase, the invisible women. Is there anything that they or society could do to make them more visible? Or is the system kind of so set against them that there's nothing that can be done?
I think every household, job seeker household where there are two adults receives 1.7 of a payment. So they receive an adult payment and 70% of an adult payment in anticipation of the dependent adult. this invisible woman that I'm talking about. I think there's a strong argument at this stage to stop that rule and to give 2 full adult payments for anti-poverty and equality reasons, and simply to make the default the administrative individualization, that each adult gets the payment in their own right, rather than the payment being collected on behalf of the second adult by the first qualified adult. So I do think that that's relatively, it's been done in pensions already, where the system is administratively individualized. I think that would not only get the money directly into the hands of the woman, but it would bring the woman's visibility into the policy system, because at the moment these women simply aren't counted. We know very little about them. We know very little about the degree to which they may be doing part-time work, for example. We don't even know how many children each of these women have, what age they are. They're very invisible. So I think bringing them administratively into the system would give them that visibility. And once people are visible, they become a policy problem that we have to solve. And I think it would shine the light on them a lot more.
Well, I want to thank Mary and Adele very much for being with us this morning and for managing to answer at least a good sample of questions that members of the Assembly have. And we will try and follow up on the questions with more facts and information for Assembly members. But as I said, the main purpose of the Assembly is for the citizens to discuss among themselves and to have the time to do that. So we're now going to move you into the breakout groups. And in terms of the topics for discussion this morning, we'd like you to focus on identifying the problems and the issues to be tackled on today's themes. So we'd like to hear your views on the following. First of all, are there inequalities in the social protection and tax systems that need to be tackled? And I think some of those issues have already been coming up in the questions just now. Secondly, do our systems meet the realities of people's lives in 21st century Ireland? If not, what groups of people are particularly affected? For example, do you agree with the speakers who've suggested that our tax and social protection systems are overly built around a male breadwinner, stay-at-home wife culture? You'll have about 40 minutes to discuss these questions, and then we'd like you to move on to discussing a second set of issues, which basically turn around the question, are Irish workplaces and the social protection system doing enough to recognise family-friendly and care responsibilities? And again, if not, what needs to be done? As we've done previously, we will play a video with some personal stories more or less halfway through the morning's discussions. It's a video that you haven't seen before, but I think you will find brings to life what we're talking about. And we will break for lunch around 12 o'clock. So we're going to put you into the breakout groups now and look forward to seeing you again later in the day. Thank you very much and have a good discussion.